Hello, and welcome to this celebration of the life and legacy of David Ray Griffin. My name is Andrew Schwartz, and I am the Executive Director of the Center for Process Studies, a position that David held starting back in 1973. So I have a privilege of welcoming you today and helping to organize this event. It's wonderful to see David's family present here, as well as all of his friends, former students, colleagues, and others who have been touched by his life over the years. Just a brief sort of housekeeping thing. We're going to have some fun. We're going to listen to some stories and some reflections. There's going to be some music. And then we're also going to have some food. So that's always nice, right? And there'll be plenty of time for conversation and fellowship because we think that's important. So it is with that I say Mary Elizabeth Moore. If you would like to come up, she's our wonderful MC, and she'll be leading us forward.
We are here to celebrate the life of David Ray Griffin, a man of huge heart, stunning intellect, and passion beyond bounds. How fitting it is that we could celebrate David's life here now, when his family has traveled from a distance to be here, when many of you have traveled from a distance to be part of the 50th anniversary conference of the Center for Process Studies. People who have learned from, read, been close friends with, and done projects with David over many years. Thank you for your presence and the spirit you bring to this celebration.
I appreciate this opportunity to pay tribute to David Griffin. His role in my life has been enormous. I was his student at the same time that he was my student. I learned from him. And I had the most keen sense of partnership that I've had with anyone. We agreed on what should be. We talked about what was needed. I had studied at the University of Chicago, when it was still resisting the value-free academic disciplines. Parts of it were supporting the thinking that we rightly associate with Alfred North Whitehead. But that resistance had collapsed. There was no longer a prestigious place giving major attention to process thought, or specifically to Whitehead. Scientism was conquering higher education, just what an unsustainable society did not need. What should we do about it? We should create a center that could show that there was empirical evidence for much that Whitehead could explain, but that scientism refused to consider. We both thought that this was a central theological task. For us, theology was not the study of one set of data, but the Christian reflection about all important questions. I've never felt such complete understanding, agreement, and sharing with anyone else. I never thought that he depended on me. Those who knew David would know that he thought for himself. We saw the same evidence, the same sources, the same world, and we came to the same conclusions, or to complementary ones. We were both disciples of Jesus, he by denomination, me just by preference. And we saw Jesus' discipleship as immensely relevant to every aspect of life and history. We both saw the modern world as profoundly antithetical to such discipleship. We both saw Whitehead as outthinking modernity and offering a wisdom that could guide the disciples of Jesus through problems that did not exist when Jesus lived. Providentially, we thought, the dream of a center was realized a few years later. It was to be my faculty project, supported by a colleague who taught half-time and led the Center for Process Studies half-time. Of course, David returned to take on that work. We worked together for a couple of decades with the same deep agreement I had with him when he was my student. He would check his plans for a conference with me, I might make a few suggestions, but I do not recall any real discussions. Now he was much more the teacher than I. He was far better scholar than I and capable of far more work. If his topic was evolutionary theory, by the time the conference was held, he knew the literature on the subject better than most of the invitees. We thought that all our work was theological, but since most theologians did not consider it such, and since most secular people did not trust theologians, we yielded to the need to separate what we did for the churches as process and faith from what we did in relation to universities. But we dealt with both from the same perspectives. When David realized that the neoconservative implemented 9/11 in order to fix U.S. foreign policy on American imperial rule, he decided, as a disciple of Jesus, he was called to expose what had happened on 9/11. This quest was rejected by both churches and universities. So David did his theology on his own. To this day, neither the churches nor the universities concern themselves with truth on this matter, nor with American imperialism. Both think that institutional health would be damaged by a pursuit of truth. And of course, institutions take priority. David believed that as a disciple of Jesus, he was committed to truth. Our society encourages political correctness or revolutionary correctness. Both ways, truth suffers. I supported David, but I did not share in his work. I have let other considerations, institutional ones often, lead me to avoid the topic much of the time. But I recognized and still recognize that David was the true prophet. There are now thousands of people, of architects and engineers, who follow. And we will hear a little more about that later. And there is a real chance that the 9/11 truth movement, to which he contributed so much, will force the government to acknowledge some of its lies. Dear David, we remember your prophetic commitments and your critical discipleship. But we also remember that you loved your enemies and that you followed Jesus to the end.
Well, hello, friends and colleagues. Those of you who, like me, have grown to love David Griffin over these years. I first met him in 1974. I had just come to Cincinnati, Ohio, and I heard about this process guy up at the University of Dayton, but I had to go up there fast because he was leaving to go to Claremont, where I had just come from. So I did drive to Dayton, and I met David. And a few years later, 15 years later, in 1990, when I went back to Claremont myself, I was so fortunate to be his colleague for the rest of his time there, and my time there as well. We had wonderful conversations together. Now, you have to know we were both interested in eschatology, right? David came at eschatology from an empirical point of view. He drew from people like Charles Peirce, a 19th century process thinker, but especially from William James, who wrote Varieties of Religious Experience. And David wanted to show, both through the writings of these scholars, but also through accounts that he had heard, either through reports or through simply hearsay, of people who had out-of-body experiences. The woman who fell down the stairs, seriously injured. The medics are there treating her. And the whole time they're treating her, she's up in the ceiling watching what's going on. And when she finally comes to again, due to their great work, she describes to them exactly what they did and what she thought about what they did. Out-of-body experience. Experience does not depend on the body. Experience is mediated through the body, but it can also be independent of the body. Well then, what about this strange thing we call immortality? If it's possible for the body, the spirit, to exist apart from its embeddedness in the body, why is there not a strong case for immortality? And so this tended to be his empirical approach, but of course it was not yet tested out in his own experience. Well, my take on eschatology was just as deep, but from an entirely different perspective. I was deeply concerned that despite of the fact that we claim that God is a God of justice, there is so little of it in the world. There are egregious pains, some of them simply physical from the deterioration of who we are, others from inflictions like holocausts, burnings, intentional harm on whole peoples and sometimes individual persons, mass shootings where life is cut down. Is there any righting of the wrongs that happen in the universe? Are there any possibilities to right the wrongs that happen simply through the course of human history and that does not happen in and through our finite lives? Justice is sometimes an illusion. But if there is an immortality, and see, this is where Whitehead comes in. Whitehead has this notion of God, where God has a very complex nature in the process world, but there is a consequent nature where God continuously receives the world into God's own being, and from this receiving of the world knows what to give back to the world in terms of next steps. You might call it a kind of crucifixion resurrection aspect to who God is. If, in fact, we are resurrected into the life of God, there's this little verse in, I think, Corinthians, we shall know as we are known. That can be horrible. What if you inflicted great harms and suddenly you are transported and now your consciousness is in God because you finished your earthly life and you experienced everything, every experience because of you? It could be hell. It could be judgment. It could also be salvation. So I do this fanciful flights of imagination, thinking how one could work with Whitehead to develop some notion of the finality of a justice which is everlasting and everlastingly ongoing. Now, it wouldn't happen if there were not something beyond life on earth. So David's point of view, it's possible for there to be a subjectivity apart from bodily experience. And my absolute insistence that there must be justice. There must be justice. If there is a God, there must be justice. And there isn't justice all the way through. And so the two of us had our very different but very complementary. Now, I would see David during his illness, not often. I live in Texas. He lived in Goleta. But I also have a friend in Goleta who's a friend of David's, and I would visit maybe once a year, and we would always go to David's house. And we would discuss upon occasion eschatology. We made a promise. I am older than David. I turned 90 in August. But that we would let each other know who was right. And I conclude my remarks by saying, I'm still waiting.
Good evening, everyone. It's my honor to speak here. I think the topic about grief and China is a big one. It will take probably 3 hours. Because due to the time limits, I want to bring up 2 points. First, David's impact on China. I think some people said constructive postmodernism and process thought is the biggest movement after John Dewey's pragmatism. Yeah. So it's also 2012 when David joined the conference in Nanking and won the president of Nanking University, Yibin Zhang. He said our generation grew up with David Griffin's book. That's why it's the re-enchantment of science. Yeah, we gave a name the postmodern science. Yeah. I think so that is today even the central government they use a word called the Chinese style ecological civilization. Oh no, Chinese style modernization. People remember in that book, David Griffin said if China can avoid the mistake the West made, China become a postmodern China. Right? So I think the government used the word Chinese style modernization is pretty close. That's the postmodern China because the Chinese style modernization is the modernization. It's the harmony of humans and nature. It's a kind of ecological civilization. Yeah. So as the people know, the ecological civilization already written into the party's constitution and China's national constitution. Yeah, it's really a big move. Yeah. So I think you can see the Chinese people really love David. Yeah. So he's not only scholar, but also a lot of lay people. Yeah. I give a small example. I think before David, last year, before David into the hospice, right? Yeah. I think there's a Chinese female Buddhist. She sent a check to May. May is a treasure people in our institute. She said, please give the money to Dr. Cobb and David Griffin for the personal use. Don't give the organization to the personal use. Yeah. You can see the people really love him and Dr. Cobb. Yeah. Second, I want to mention David's impact on myself. David is my teacher. He was the chair of my dissertation committee. Yeah. I learned a lot from him, not only academic world, also in my personal life. First, I learned, that's me how to say. I learned the first thing I learned is one person can achieve a lot, even it's a very single person, very common person. You never can think about the scholar in Claremont, in CST, scholar, professor like David Griffin, can produce such a huge influence in China. Yeah, that's one person. Yeah, right now in China, people know we have more than 30 centers. Yeah, so many books, articles published. Yeah, and this is also another things I learned from David is that it expand your love to others, to nature. That means make live yourself bigger. In modern time, lots of people, including ourselves, we live smaller because we only live for ourselves, for our family. There's nothing wrong for that. But in order to make yourself live bigger, you better care about others, care about our universe, care about your community. Yeah. I think David is the thing I learned from him is how to live bigger. He reminded me think about the Chinese traditional 大人, a great man or big man. The Chinese regard the human being as the heart of the universe. I think David is the heart of our universe, who care not only about the U.S., not only China, care about the whole universe. That's our David. Yeah. So I think that's what I learned from David. There's a Chinese, there's Chinese very famous journal called Boyang Liquor Journal. The chief editor, her name is Yingfeng Hu. May organize the Chinese memorial service for David Griffin. Around 200 Chinese joined this event. So this chief editor also joined this event. She said, we should love David more. We should admire David more. David more, yeah. That is really come from a lot of Chinese people's heart. As a conclusion, I want to quote a Chinese, we call a postmodern poet or organic farmer, Angela Yu. Some people know her. She used the phrase, "You love, therefore you are." I think, David, you love, therefore you are. You live there always with us. Thank you.
My name is Sherry Kling, and I'm going to read some remarks written by Beth Johnson, who was not able to be here tonight to share them herself. She writes this. A paper returned saturated in red ink was a sign of David's engagement with the paper, with the ideas, with us, his students. He took us seriously and expected us to take our writing and thinking seriously. He even corrected footnotes. Who does that? I was offended when other professors returned my papers with nary a red mark. David's enlightened religious pluralism made this Unitarian Universalist feel at home here and provided inspiration for what was possible in my ministry. His good humor was and still is a joy to experience. Once, when I expressed my enthusiastic appreciation of the notion of three ultimates, David leaned back, his eyes danced, and he suggested that I had Trinity envy. David inspired me with his passion for justice and his empathy. I recall sitting in our religious pluralism and global ethics class. It was after the invasion of Iraq. A plane flew overhead, loud and low, shaking the windows. David fell silent, cocked his head. We could feel the emotion that David embodied in that moment as he said, "And they are living with that every day." We knew what he meant, a world away, but as present as the breath. Bombs were being dropped on innocents in that illegal and immoral occupation that shaped us all. Then I witnessed David's courageous turn toward 9/11 truth, and he made me brave. David's constructive, postmodern process thought addressed with clarity every area that I, in preparing for UU ministry, was concerned with. Theology, philosophy, feminism, morality, religious pluralism, science and religion, evil, social justice, and as an added bonus for me, my own personal interest in Jungian and depth psychology. In all of what we've heard presented here with such skill and expertise related to David's influence in the academy, we who trained with David for ministry felt supremely equipped to engage with in our ministries. I feel I can offer something substantive to my folks as we grapple with imagining new possibilities for us as a spiritually diverse and justice-seeking religious community and in the wider world. As I prepare sermons, worship, and do pastoral care, David's influence is with me. As I defend and protect animals and the earth, David's influence is with me. In the possibilities that emerge from the multiplicity of voices in the Occupy space, I see the constructive postmodern vision pulsing. David has shaped me as a thinker, a minister, an activist. I live from what he taught and exposed me to. I am still continually enriched in fresh ways by his engaged and compassionate teaching, rigorous thinking and writing, and by his brave example of speaking truth to power. We all continue to live from the influence of David Ray Griffin, and we, and the world are better for it. David, thank you for the grand adventure that you have boldly led us on. Blessings on this new adventure, my beloved teacher. I love you.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I'm Kevin Barrett, and I have an article published out on the internet called How David Ray Griffin Changed My Life. And so that's the long version and the printed version, and I'll give you a brief spoken version. When I was in graduate school in the late 1980s and 1990s, I discovered that amongst all this vast wasteland of structuralism and post-structuralism and this, that, and the other, all reactions to the scientism that was dominating the academy, there were basically three schools of thought that I could find that actually had anything worthwhile to say. The first was Bakhtinian dialogism. The second I encountered was the traditionalism of René Girard, and I followed those people into Islam. And then finally, of course, there was the process thought of John Cobb and David Ray Griffin. And of all of these stunning discoveries, perhaps the most stunning and craziest of all was that the best single guide to empirical reality across a wide range of disciplines and areas was this theologian, a Christian theologian, David Ray Griffin. So I was shocked and surprised to find that. And I did cite David. I read a bunch of his work and cited him in my dissertation on Sufism in Morocco. And then, after 9/11 happened, I was the only Muslim in Madison, Wisconsin, who didn't immediately just know that 9/11 was some sort of inside job. I said, let's wait and see the evidence, guys. And everybody else said, come on. So I was suspicious from the get-go, but I figured that, it's probably one of these things that we'll never really know. And I was finishing my dissertation, very busy, trying to learn Arabic, get my Arabic up to speed. And it wasn't until late 2003 when I heard that David was working on the new Pearl Harbor and that he was going to be asserting that the World Trade Center was demolished with explosives. It didn't just fall down from plane crashes and fires. And that whatever happened to the Pentagon, it certainly wasn't hit by a jet airplane piloted by a guy who was incapable of flying a Cessna training aircraft, doing an amazing corkscrew dive and pulling multiple Gs and leveling out at the lawn, not putting a scratch on the lawn, but flying straight into the accounting office, which had just lost $2.3 trillion the night before, according to Donald Rumsfeld. So the absurdity of this official story became just what was stunning to me when I looked into it, thanks to hearing about what David was looking into, was not so much that they, meaning our wonderful national security state and its partners, would do this, but rather how absurdly, shamefully obvious it was. Did these people have no shame? Couldn't they have at least created some slightly more plausible cover story? Are our intelligence agencies that incompetent? It made me angry in a lot of ways. When the book came out, I wasn't surprised that it was as good as it was, knowing David's work. And I started talking about it and doing teach-ins at the University of Wisconsin. At some point, I think I handed the book to a friend of mine who was the local imam at one of the 3 mosques in Madison. He was doing some interfaith work, and he had met a guy named Jim Goulding, who, as it turns out, got his PhD in Christian history from Claremont and was teaching at Edgewood College of Madison, a Catholic school. And my friend, Sally, the imam, said, "Hey, you should read this book. It shows that 9/11 was an inside job. They blew up the towers, and whatever happened to the Pentagon, it wasn't that hijacked plane." And Jim Goulding, he thought, wow, this must be some kind of crazy Muslim belief. He couldn't believe it. He said, "Okay, I'll look at the book." And Sally handed the book, and he said, "David Ray Griffin? I studied with him. He was the smartest guy in my class, the smartest guy in my university. What, he wrote this?" And so Jim was totally flabbergasted. And then the next thing you know, Jim and I were talking about bringing David to Madison to give a speech at the University of Wisconsin. And this would have been in late 2004. So we organized that event, and sorry, Jim passed away a couple of years ago. So I guess from the other world, he won't mind me saying that I did most of the work. But he provided moral support, and we got David to Madison, and a couple of days before the event, C-SPAN, just out of the blue, called my house, and my son did some kind of prank answer, and so they had to call back a couple of times to finally tell me that they were coming to Madison to film this. And that suddenly put it on the radar screen. It was the first time ever that the 9/11 Truth Movement had gotten any major media publicity. So David showed up in Madison. We had dinner with him. He gave an incredible talk, and I got to have breakfast with him the next morning. And fantastic conversation. I'm still in awe of his intellect. And the success of that event made it inevitable that I would end up walking this bizarre path that I've had to walk ever since then. I ended up getting chosen as the whipping boy of the Scholars for 9/11 Truth. I was the guy that the state legislature in Madison attacked and said I had to be fired from the university because I was corrupting the youth of Athens or something like that. And so next thing you know, I'm on Fox News fighting with Hannity, and the administration is begging me to please go hide in a cabin somewhere. Don't talk to the media. And I'm saying, we're trying to get this message out, and I'm sorry, I have to talk to the media somewhat. And they said, just please don't go on Fox anymore. And I said, okay, not till the semester's over. And this whole experience made me unemployable in the American and indeed the entire Western Academy. And since my wife and family were not that interested in going to some place like Iran or Malaysia or some free country where you're allowed to talk about the most important political things in the world, unlike in this God-forsaken police state that we live in, I ended up having to become a crowd-funded troublemaker, which is what I've been doing ever since. And I've been blessed to be working with the real thinkers, the people of real intellect and heart, the true truth seekers of our time, are mostly on that other side of the divide. And I've been forced into that world, and I thank God that I have, because I've gotten to work with people like David, John Cobb, who I regard as obviously one of the most important thinkers of this age, maybe any age, and some other really, really amazing people. Sheikh Imran Hossein, who is one of the very few Muslim thinkers out there with something powerful to say about today's world. It's been a great path, and I thank God and David Ray Griffin for putting me on it.
Hello, John Buchanan. I appreciate the opportunity to be able to talk at this very special event. I was fortunate enough to have David as a teacher and a mentor, and I'm honored to say he became a colleague and a friend. I did not ask him to be on my dissertation committee because I was afraid of what that might entail. And I think I made the right decision, because I had to get 3 extensions for my at Emory to complete the dissertation. and with David looking it over, I'd still be working on it. I was I was thinking about how to sort of summarize David's character and wonderful traits. I recalled two times I corresponded with him while I was doing some writing after I graduated, and I sent him. I was trying to revise my dissertation into a book, so I sent him quite a bit of material that I was working on, and he sent back a letter with all kinds of suggestions and corrections, and then at the end he said, I have a more radical suggestion. Why don't you start from scratch? and John Cobb told me that he'd given David Griffin that same advice at one point in time, so I guess he felt he had to pass it on. But in the second letter, I worked away, and a few years later sent him about 150 pages, I think, of a manuscript to see what he thought. And about a month went by, and I got a 5-page handwritten letter back, and and it was a lot of suggestions and corrections, and but it started out with an apology for having taken so long to get back to me. And I thought, well, a month isn't bad, really, for 150 pages. But I said when he got my mailing, he was in the hospital recovering from back surgery. But as soon as the painkillers wore off enough for him to think clearly, he started working on it, and which I thought was a pretty good excuse. But then he. At the end of the letter, he said, I hope you'll forgive an old professor for not being able to resist giving you all this critique. And he said, you probably wanted what William James said we all want: praise, raw, coarse praise. Which I think is just a wonderful example of his. He just such a wonderful sense of humor. A person with so many other qualities you might not think would be that lighthearted and just so much fun. But he maybe had to have that to be able to do the things he did. And I also remember he just seems to enjoy life so much. Being around him, he was just enjoying every moment. But more than that. I think those two letters are exemplative of his generosity of his spirit, his dedication and resolve to the work, and his empathy and humility. The last thing I wanted to share was, as I was lying in the bathtub last night, a lot of my ideas come to me when I'm in the bathtub. I was thinking. I recalled a movie I always brings a tear to my eye at the end is How Green Was My Valley. And I thought there's something at the end of that that's I think might be relevant. So fortunately I could look it up on my iPhone. And the final lines of that film are, you may recall Rodney McDowell's father has been killed in a mine accident, and several of his brothers have gone off to America. But he says, there's a narration over the last scene, and he says, men like my father cannot die. They are with me still, real in memory as they were in flesh, loving and beloved forever.
Hi, I'm Catherine Keller, and it was nearly half a century ago when I studied with that young David Griffin, even younger than the young John Cobb he was working with and had studied with just before. And so I won't go on and on about the vibrancy and the wit and the brilliant logic of his teaching and the supportiveness and always the slight edge of scariness. But all that rolled into ongoing encounters, dialogues, exchanges, friendship, spaced out over decades, and I was very fortunate to be able to visit him and Ann last summer, and to be so moved by his full understanding that he was dying, and utter serenity, his good humor still there, his wit still glowing through. But really, I just want to nail the thing that really influenced me for decades. A, God is all good. B, God is all powerful. C, there's real evil in the world. Ergo, God does not exist. So in that syllogism, the syllogism of the problem of theodicy, that his book, God, Power, and Evil, nails like this, he just makes so perfectly gracefully clear that that second premise has to go, that notion of God's omnipotent, all power, all controlling power. And when persuasive power is substituted in for coercive power, the syllogism works quite differently, and God gets to exist. So, yeah, Griffin's theodicy, I just teach it over and over and over. It has a strange, liberating, clarifying effect for my theology students. And the fact is that on the basis of that syllogism, David went on in so many different dimensions and at so many different scales, summoning that good against the forms of evil that continued and that have been beautifully mentioned here, that have been so systemic. And that good persisted right on through to the end, and the end isn't ending because that goodness is reverberating through all of us, all of you. And let it always have that ironic sparkle of David Griffin's wisdom shining through it.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Andrew Davis. I'm the program director of the Center for Process Studies, and as such, stand literally in the shadow of David Griffin. And what I'd like to offer here is essentially a combinatorial reading that I'm titling Journey Towards Truth, Griffin in his own words. I'd like to preface it with two passages from Scripture. The first passage comes from John 18, 37 to 38. Jesus said, "For this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice." Pilate said to him, "What is truth?" The second scriptural passage comes from the Mundaka Upanishad, 3.1. Truth alone conquers, not untruth. By truth is laid out the path leading to the gods, by which the sages who have their desires fulfilled traveled to where is that supreme abode of truth. The twofold task of a theologian is to speak the truth, and to speak the truth as to set at liberty. If, per impossible, there were no God, there would be no truth for scientists, philosophers, and theologians to be seeking. We engage in this search without end because we presuppose there is always a more complete truth to be reached. It is very difficult to believe that this life itself should be conceived as a spiritual journey if this journey is to come to an end so soon. Because of our awareness of the tremendous gap between the real and the ideal, between what we are now and what we sense we should be. It is hard to orient this life around a movement toward the ideal if this life be all that we have. Given the possibility that global warming may result in human extinction in the not-too-distant future, the only secure basis for hope in our time lies where it always has, in hope for a life beyond bodily death. Even if the idea that humanity will soon become extinct turns out to be untrue, that fate will come about sometime, and it remains true that we will all eventually die. So the only empirical ground for hope lies in evidence for a life after death. I suggest this answer with fear and trembling, knowing that most of my friends and other people whose opinions I respect will hate this answer. In any case, I believe the reasons to hate the idea of life after death, as weighty as they are outweighed by the reasons for affirming life after death. Only I am convinced if we come to see human life as primarily a spiritual adventure, an adventurous journey that continues beyond this life, will we have a chance of becoming sufficiently free from destructive modern motivations to effect a transition to a sustainable global order. It is not irrational to believe in life after death. It may, in fact, be most rational, given the amazing universe in which we were born. In addition, it has long been observed that those convinced of life after death, from Jesus and the first Christians, to those who have fought for civil rights, to those who have had near-death experiences, do not suffer from a debilitating fear that would prevent them from taking risks in pursuit of truth and justice. Salvation should not be understood as being saved from an everlasting hell, as if there were such a place. This does not mean that life beyond bodily death is neither impossible or unimportant. But there is much more to salvation than continuing to live after bodily death. Rather, it involves transformation into people who love God with all their heart, soul, mind, and strength, and their neighbors as themselves. Salvation is ultimately fidelity to God instead of to one's empire and or idols. Besides providing time for souls to be sanctified by developing fidelity to God, life after death would also give us more time to make greater contributions to God. So thank you, David, for the contributions you've made to our lives and to the contributions you, even now, continue to make to the life of God. May the adventure continue.
在这繁忙的时代，人们谈论生态危机已经很久了，但绝大部分的人常常并不理解生态危机到底有多严重，而只是沉浸在对物质的渴望中努力、忙碌、疯狂。还好，在这世间一直有人在试图努力帮助人类规避毁灭的命运，探索解困之道。世界著名建设型后现代思想家、有机过程哲学第4代传人大卫·格里芬博士就是其中的佼佼者。他像暗夜中的明灯，为世界找到一条光明之道。格里芬的老师，世界著名后现代思想家，我们时代的生态圣贤小约翰·科布院士说
Never known anyone so completely committed to the truth as David Griffin. It never occurred to him that because he was a Christian, he should believe things that he did not have reason to believe were true. And he did not believe because he was an American that he should believe things just because the American government told him to. The pursuit of truth is a gift and a grace that I greatly, greatly appreciate. And it's rare today. So many people think about what will have the effect that I want. But David was committed to truth.
作为建设性后现代哲学的领军人物，格里芬终其一生致力于揭示西式现代性背后的个人主义、人类中心主义、父权制、机械化、经济主义、消费主义、民族主义和军国主义的底层逻辑，以使世界，准确地说，使人们对世界的认知回归有机哲学所发现的那样，万物处于运动和关系中，整个宇宙是万物交织而成的一个有机体。侠之大者，为国为民。建设性后现代哲学家们多有知行合一的情怀，格里芬是其代表。为了追求人与人、国与国的平等，乃至众生的平等，他不仅铁骨铮铮对霸道，勇敢地挑战形形色色的霸权，为他者瞻目，为弱小直言，而且致力于人与自然的共同福祉，主张将爱拓展到有情万物，关爱一切生命。他是一位真正意义上的忠诚世界的哲学家，一位具有侠骨柔情的生态侠者，为地球及其世间一切有情众生的大爱之情构筑了他侠骨柔情的底色。他对美帝国及其各种霸权霸道的痛恨和阻击就源自这种长情大爱。除了后现代科学、后现代精神，没有超自然主义的反媚和怀特海另类后现代哲学等中国学者熟悉的学术著作。为了挑战美帝国的霸权，格里芬10年间写下了10余部揭露美帝国图谋和抨击美国霸权主义的专著，其中《新珍珠港》、美国诡计神圣还是邪恶和空前的生态危机已在中国出版。和其他建设性后现代思想家和有机过程哲学家一样，格里芬格外青睐中国文化，对中国的生态文明建设充满美好期待。他衷心希望中国成功地规避西式现代化的弊端，走一条超现代化之路，以及生态文明之路。他不仅2002年和教育部长袁贵仁一起主持了北京怀特海大会，而且2012年他拖着患癌后虚弱的病体前往中国，参加了哈尔滨师范大学举办的建设性后现代主义与中国的教育改革，哈尔滨工业大学的建设性后现代主义与中国，山东大学的建设性后现代思想与生态美学，和东南大学的马克思主义后现代主义与社会发展等一系列国际学术研讨会，并为南京过程研究中心剪了彩。和科布院士一样，他坚信中国给世界带来了生态文明的希望之光。他的建设性后现代理念正激发着一代受他思想和人格影响的中国学者，努力探索人与自然和谐共生的中国式现代化之路，努力建设生态文明。他是一个认真的哲学家，他所福音的哲学也许也塑造了他对生命的态度。死亡也是过程，不必成为终结。在弥留之际，格里芬致信友人，做颇为家常的告别。他说自己反正也懒得去更新驾照了。2022年11月25日，陈2次获得诺贝尔和平奖提名， 我们时代最重要和最有影响力的思想家之一的格里芬博士，我们时代的英雄，在他和妻子安妮亲自建成的生态屋里安详离世，享年83岁，哲学巨星自此陨落。这一刻，巨人离席。此刻，荧幕前的我们，都曾与格里芬的生命有过时间上的交叠。请记得有机世界纯星闪耀时，星光曾经照耀你我。真正使格里芬闪耀的，是他创造性地奉献了时代所需要的、所稀缺的理论、精神和温度。他的学说无意间被传承，他的精神将被发扬，他的智慧将被铭记，他对众生念念不忘的爱与关切将会薪火相传，生生不息。所以，亲爱的格里芬博士，你爱，故你在，你会一直跟我们在一起。格里芬博士，千古。
David, you walked a mystical path. So I speak to you now as we close. David, your students were terrified of you. How could we possibly engage such complex ideas with such an erudite professor? Well, Dr. Griffin would lead us. David, your colleagues marveled at the dozens of books you wrote on dozens of subjects, and hundreds of scholars in different fields with whom you engaged at a sophisticated intellectual level. How could one person know so much about so much? Well, your curiosity had no limits, and your passion for study and learning. David, your colleagues admired your leadership of the Center for Process Studies and the ways in which you brought creative energy, fresh ideas, hands and feet, and determination never to say, we can't do that. At the same time, we sit here tonight and we wonder about what John Cobb has been telling us for the last several days. The priority in David's life was to follow Jesus Christ. How can one man who loved his family so much and who loved learning and writing and following Jesus Christ so much keep it all together? Well, you were a man who knew your priorities, you knew your values, and you were going to stick to them no matter what. David, people brought to you their intractable problems, intractable theological, ecological, global, political problems. And you wrestled each one to the ground. Well, you never saw an intractable problem. You saw invitations to engage, to unravel, and to make this world a better place. Thank you, dear friend. And now I invite you to meet with one another, to visit, to enjoy refreshments, to welcome Ann and David's whole family. And now, may you go in peace to make peace. Amen.